morning began as mornings at number 4. Privet Drive always began in summer, with the mechanical click of the kitchen clock marking 7, the measured tread of Vernon Dursley's footsteps overhead, and the particular quality of light that came through Petunia's lace curtains, filtered, pale, the color of skimmed milk. Petunia had been awake since 6:30. She hadn't needed the alarm. Her body kept time as precisely as the oven timer, as reliably as the schedule she maintained for bin collection and the rotation of her best towels. She had dressed in a cream blouse and pressed slacks, made the bed with hospital corners, and descended to the kitchen while the house was still holding the coolness of night. The kettle was on. The radio murmured something about traffic on the M25. She moved through her morning tasks with the efficiency of long practice, teacups set just so, the good biscuits arranged on a plate, the newspaper retrieved from the front step and placed at Vernon's usual spot. She had planned to go to the bakery. This had been decided 3 days ago. Dudley had been genuinely trying with his new diet, and she'd thought a small cake might mark his progress. Something to acknowledge his effort, not a large cake, nothing excessive, just something to say, "Well done, darling, we've noticed." The bakery opened at 7:30. She'd timed her arrival for 7:45 after the initial rush of people collecting bread for their breakfasts. The morning was already warm, promising another scorching day. The pavement radiated yesterday's heat. Mrs. Henderson from number 7 had waved from her garden, and Petunia had waved back, exchanging pleasantries about the weather. Both of them standing in their separate gardens, discussing the drought and the hosepipe ban. With the same measured concern they might discuss a minor illness in a distant relative. The bakery had smelled of sugar and yeast. The woman behind the counter, not the owner, someone younger, someone Petunia didn't know, had smiled and asked what she needed. A small chocolate cake, Petunia had said. Something simple. Special occasion, the woman had asked, making conversation as she moved toward the display. Petunia had hesitated. "My son," she said finally. "He's been doing very well with something." The woman had nodded, understanding nothing, caring less. She'd selected a round chocolate cake with neat piped edges, boxed it carefully, tied it with string. Petunia had paid with exact change and walked home with the white bakery box held level in both hands, the string cutting slightly into her fingers. Vernon had still been eating breakfast when she returned. He'd grunted acknowledgment of her entrance, absorbed in an article about company cars. Dudley hadn't emerged from his room yet. The house was full of its usual sounds. Vernon's methodical chewing, the rustle of newspaper, the tick of the clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator. Petunia had set the box on the counter. She'd untied the string carefully, winding it around her fingers to save. String was always useful. She'd opened the box to check that the cake hadn't shifted during the walk home. It was perfect. Glossy chocolate icing, neat and symmetrical. She closed the box again, left it on the counter, and turned to put the string in the drawer where she kept such things. That was when she glanced at the calendar. The calendar hung on the wall beside the refrigerator, exactly where it had hung every year for as long as they'd lived in this house. It was a large format calendar with photographs of English gardens, ordered from the charity shop months in advance. Each month showed a different garden: roses in June, lavender in July. Petunia marked important dates with a neat pencil, appointments, bin days, Dudley's tennis lessons, Vernon's Rotary Club meetings. She'd marked July 31st 2 weeks ago, without thinking. Dudley's diet milestone, 6 weeks of proper meals and portion control. She stared at the date now. July 31st. Her hand was still on the drawer handle. She didn't close it. She stood there, very still, looking at the number written in her own careful handwriting. The radio continued its murmur. Vernon turned a page. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car drove past, its engine fading into the distance. Somewhere further down the street, someone's sprinkler made its rhythmic ticking sound despite the hosepipe ban. Petunia looked at the calendar. She looked at the bakery box. She looked back at the calendar. July 31st. She closed the drawer. The sound seemed very loud. Vernon didn't look up. Petunia turned back to the counter. The cake sat in its white box, lid slightly askew where she'd checked it. Chocolate. She'd chosen chocolate without thinking. Dudley liked chocolate. She'd been thinking of Dudley, but it was July 31st. Her hand went to the edge of the counter and rested there. The formica was cool under her palm, smooth and clean. She'd wiped it down already this morning, as she did every morning. There was a very faint pattern in it, meant to look like marble. She'd chosen it herself when they'd renovated the kitchen years ago now. Vernon had wanted something darker, but she'd insisted on this, pale, clean, practical. She stood there with her hand on the counter, looking at the cake. She couldn't remember the last time she'd bought a birthday cake. They didn't really do cakes anymore, not since Dudley had become conscious of his weight. Birthdays were meals at restaurants now, or envelopes with money, or practical gifts like the new trainers Vernon had bought him in May. The last cake had been years ago. Dudley's 11th birthday, perhaps, or 12th. One of those elaborate affairs from the expensive bakery in town, decorated like a football pitch or a racing car. Something enormous and costly, and consumed mostly by Dudley's friends. Before that, she'd made them, herself, every year. Victoria sponge with buttercream, or chocolate cake with chocolate icing, or lemon drizzle for variety. She'd been good at cakes once. Her mother had taught her. Not elaborate decorating, nothing fancy, but proper, reliable baking. The kind that tasted like it was meant to, that rose evenly and didn't sink in the middle. Her mother had taught both of them, actually. Petunia's hand pressed slightly harder against the counter. She hadn't meant to think that, hadn't meant to remember that there had been 2 daughters learning to crack eggs against the bowl's edge, 2 girls taking turns stirring, 2 children licking wooden spoons while their mother laughed and told them they'd spoil their dinner. The radio said something about the weather forecast, continued hot and dry, temperatures in the high 20s. Vernon cleared his throat and turned another page. Petunia looked at the calendar again. July 31st. She knew this date. Of course she knew it. She'd known it for 36 years. She'd known it longer than she'd known Vernon, longer than she'd known about Dudley, longer than she'd known most things she considered fundamental to her life. But she hadn't thought, when she'd marked the calendar, she hadn't connected. She'd been thinking of Dudley, only Dudley, 6 weeks on his new diet plan, a small acknowledgement, a mother noticing her son's efforts. She hadn't thought that July 31st was also, that it had always also been. The kitchen felt very warm suddenly, despite the early hour. The sun was higher now, coming more directly through the window. It caught the chrome of the taps and made them glare. It lit up the counter where the cake sat, still in its box, the white cardboard almost glowing. Petunia moved then. She picked up the kettle, filled it at the sink, set it back on the hob. The water made its familiar sound, rushing from the tap. She turned the gas on, heard the click and whoosh of ignition. Normal sounds, morning sounds, the sounds of a day proceeding as planned. But she didn't move away from the sink. She stood there, looking out the window at the back garden. The lawn was yellowing despite Vernon's efforts. The flower beds looked parched. Everything needed water. The hosepipe ban meant she could only use watering cans now, filling them at the kitchen tap, carrying them out in the evening when the sun wasn't so fierce. It took 3 trips to water the roses alone. She'd planted those roses the summer before Dudley was born. White roses, because she'd liked the cleanness of them. They'd thrived for years. But this summer, they looked tired, their leaves dusty, their blooms smaller than usual. Her sister had liked roses too. Red ones, bright vivid red, the kind Petunia had thought were slightly vulgar. Show-off flowers. Look at me flowers. Of course, Lily had liked them. Petunia's throat felt tight. She turned away from the window. The kettle was starting to hiss. She took down another teacup. She'd need more tea at this rate, and spooned leaves into the pot. The everyday motions. 1 spoon per person, 1 for the pot. The rule her mother had taught her. Both of them. Vernon's chair scraped. "I'm heading in early," he said, his voice booming in the quiet kitchen. "Conference call with the Hamburg office." "Yes," Petunia said. Her voice came out normal. "You mentioned. Should be back by 6. He was standing now, folding his newspaper with sharp creases. "Tell Dudley I'll take him to the club this evening if he likes. Good to keep up with the exercise." "I'll tell him." Vernon moved toward the hallway, then paused. She felt him looking at her back. "You all right, pet?" "Fine," she said, not turning around. "Just warm." "Going to be a scorcher," Vernon agreed. "Right then, see you this evening." She heard his footsteps in the hall, the jingle of car keys, the front door opening and closing. The car started in the driveway. She listened to it reverse, heard him drive away down Privet Drive, the engine fading into the general morning sounds of the neighborhood. The kettle reached its boil and clicked off. Petunia stood in her kitchen, alone now, except for Dudley upstairs, and she didn't complete the thought. She poured the water into the teapot, set the kettle back on the hob, covered the pot with the cozy to let it steep. All the normal things. The cake sat on the counter. She should put it away. In the refrigerator, perhaps, to keep it fresh. Or in the larder. Or she should put it back in the box and tie the string again and put it somewhere out of sight until she decided what to do with it. She should do something with it. Instead, she stood there, one hand resting on the counter again, looking at it. Chocolate cake with piped edges, small, neat, appropriate for a minor celebration. Nothing excessive. Nothing that said birthday, really. Just a cake. Just something she'd bought this morning because she'd been thinking of her son and wanting to acknowledge his effort. The calendar showed July 31st in her own handwriting. Upstairs, a door opened. Dudley's room. She heard his heavy tread across the landing, the bathroom door closing. The pipes creaked as he turned on the shower. Normal morning sounds. Her son awake, beginning his day. And down the hall, in the smallest bedroom, there would be another person. also awake probably. He always woke early, also beginning another day of this strange, tense summer. Another day of living in this house where he'd lived most of his life but had never quite belonged. Another, July 31st. Petunia pulled out a chair and sat down at the kitchen table, something she almost never did at this hour. She was supposed to be preparing breakfast now. She was supposed to be organizing the day, starting laundry, planning dinner. Instead, she sat with her hands folded on the table, looking at the cake on the counter and the calendar on the wall, and the sun coming through her lace curtains, filtered and pale, the color of milk. The house was very quiet. The radio had moved on to the news. Something about the Prime Minister, something about hospitals. She wasn't listening. She was thinking about two girls in a different kitchen, long ago, learning to make cake. Vernon Dursley prided himself on his powers of observation. A successful businessman, and he was successful, very successful, thank you very much, needed to read situations quickly, needed to understand what wasn't being said as much as what was, needed to know when to push forward and when to let things lie. This morning required letting things lie. He'd known something was wrong the moment he'd walked into the kitchen at 8:15, showered and dressed, expecting his breakfast and his newspaper and the beginning of another ordinary day. Petunia had been standing at the counter with her back to him, utterly still, in a way that wasn't like her at all. Petunia was always moving in the mornings, wiping, straightening, preparing. She didn't simply stand. And there had been a cake on the counter. He'd registered this in the particular way one registers things that don't quite fit. A white bakery box, lid off, showing chocolate cake. Too early in the day for cake. Too hot for cake, really, in this weather. Cake for no reason he could immediately identify. He'd sat down at his place. He'd picked up his newspaper. She'd already set it out for him, creased exactly as he liked, and he'd made a show of reading it while watching his wife from the corner of his eye. She'd poured his tea eventually, set out his toast. But her movements had been odd, careful, as though she was thinking about something else entirely, and her hands were just going through motions they knew by heart. Vernon had eaten his breakfast and read his paper and not asked any questions. Now it was nearly noon, and he was sitting in his office at Grunning's, door closed, telephone off the hook, doing absolutely nothing. This was unlike him. Vernon Dursley did not sit idle during working hours. He made calls. He reviewed contracts. He dictated memos to his secretary. He projected an air of constant purposeful activity because that was what directors did. That was how one justified the corner office and the reserved parking space and the salary that allowed for a 4-bedroom house on Privet Drive. But he couldn't seem to focus on the papers in front of him. He kept thinking about Petunia's face when he'd asked if she was all right. He kept thinking about the cake. Vernon shifted in his chair, which creaked under his weight. The office was stuffy despite the fan rotating slowly in the corner. His secretary had brought him coffee an hour ago, and it sat cooling on his desk, untouched. Outside his window, the car park shimmered with heat. A few employees were taking early lunch, walking toward their cars with jackets slung over their shoulders. He should be working. He had the Hamburg conference call in. He checked his watch. 40 minutes. He should be reviewing his notes, preparing his talking points. The Germans were sticklers for preparation. They'd know immediately if he hadn't done his homework. Instead, he found himself thinking about dates. Vernon wasn't good with dates generally. That was Petunia's domain. She kept the calendar, marked the important days, reminded him when he needed to send flowers to his mother or attend some function or other. He remembered their anniversary because she made sure he remembered. And he remembered Dudley's birthday because it was his son, for heaven's sake, and Christmas because everyone remembered Christmas. But there were other dates that lodged in one's mind, whether one wanted them there or not. July 31st, for instance. He'd known, of course, when he'd glanced at Petunia's calendar that morning. He'd seen the date marked there in her neat pencil. Something about Dudley, no doubt. And he'd known immediately what else that date meant. He'd chosen not to acknowledge it. This was deliberate. This was policy. There were things in the Dursley household that simply weren't discussed, and this was foremost among them. That whole business, that whole impossible, unnatural, deeply uncomfortable business that had landed on their doorstep 16 years ago and never quite gone away. Vernon's jaw tightened. He'd been 24 when he'd met Petunia, young, ambitious, newly promoted to junior management at Grunnings. She'd been working as a secretary at a firm in the same building, beautiful in a precise, careful way that had immediately appealed to him. Neat, proper, no nonsense about her, the kind of girl who ironed her skirts and wore her hair just so, and would make an excellent wife for a man going places. They'd courted for 8 months, very properly. Dinners at respectable restaurants, weekend drives in his sensible car, one memorable trip to Blackpool where he'd nearly proposed, but had decided to wait until he had the ring properly picked out. He'd met her parents, nice people, normal people. Father worked for the council, mother kept a clean house. They'd approved of him, he could tell. Thought Petunia was doing well for herself, landing a young man with prospects. There had been a sister. He'd known that. Younger, still living at home when he'd first visited. Pretty girl, red hair, too much energy. She'd been polite enough to him, but there had been something. He'd never quite put his finger on it. Something off about her. Something that made him vaguely uncomfortable, though he couldn't say why. And then Petunia had told him. They'd been engaged by then. 3 months engaged, planning a spring wedding. She told him over dinner at an Italian restaurant he'd taken her to. Mid-meal, actually. Right after the waiter had cleared their starter plates. She'd folded her hands on the table and told him, very calmly, that there was something he needed to know about her family before they married. Vernon had assumed debt, or illness, or some embarrassing relative they'd have to support. Instead, she told him. He still didn't like to think about it directly, even now. She told him her sister was a witch, not metaphorically, not as an insult. Actually, literally, impossibly a witch, going to a school for witches, learning to do things, unnatural things, magic. He thought she was joking at first, some strange test of his sense of humor. But Petunia didn't joke about serious matters, and her face had been absolutely serious. White, actually. Strained, as though the words cost her something to say. He'd nearly called off the engagement. He'd come very close. He'd gone home that night and sat up until 2 in the morning, thinking about it, about what it meant, about whether he could tie himself to a family with that kind of abnormality in it. But Petunia had made it clear She wanted nothing to do with it, wanted nothing to do with her sister's freakishness. She was normal. She'd always been normal. She intended to stay normal. And when they married, they would have a normal life together, in a normal house, with normal friends and normal children, and absolutely no contact with any of that business. He'd believed her. He'd wanted to believe her. And it had been fine, mostly. The sister had barely come to their wedding, showed up with some dreadful man who looked like he'd slept in his suit, stayed for an hour, left early. Good riddance. They'd moved to Privet Drive. Vernon had continued his steady climb at Grunnings. Petunia had kept a perfect house. They'd had Dudley, their beautiful, normal, wonderfully ordinary son. They'd been happy. And then one November morning, they'd opened their front door to find a basket containing a baby. Vernon's hands had curled into fists on his desk. Even now, 15 years later, the memory made his blood pressure rise. The sheer audacity of it. Leaving a child on a doorstep. No warning, no discussion, just a letter pinned to a blanket explaining that the boy's parents were dead and Petunia was his only living relative, and they were to keep him. As though they had no choice in the matter, as though their normal, carefully constructed life could simply absorb this intrusion. Petunia had cried. He remembered that clearly. She'd read the letter and her face had crumpled, and she'd cried in a way he'd almost never seen her cry before or since, not even at her parents' funerals. Great gasping sobs. She'd frightened baby Dudley, who'd started crying too. Vernon had wanted to take the basket to the police station, to the orphanage, to anywhere that would take responsibility for it so they wouldn't have to. But Petunia had said no. He'd never quite understood why. Even now, he didn't fully understand it. She'd made it clear she didn't want the boy. She resented him. She treated him exactly as what he was, an unwanted obligation. But she'd insisted they keep him. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was duty. Perhaps it was some complicated feeling about her sister that Vernon had never been able to untangle. Whatever it was, the boy had stayed, and Vernon had done his best to pretend he wasn't there. This had worked reasonably well for years. The boy was quiet, at least, kept to himself, ate what he was given without complaint, didn't break things or cause trouble beyond the occasional bit of. Vernon didn't like to think about those incidents either. The unexplainable things, the impossible things, the zoo incident, the hair growing back, that business with the pudding. They didn't discuss those things. They happened, and then everyone pretended they hadn't happened, and life went on. It was better that way. Vernon checked his watch again. 20 minutes until the conference call. He really should review his notes. Instead, he thought about this morning, about Petunia standing in the kitchen, about the cake on the counter, about July 31st, the boy's birthday. He knew that, of course. How could he not know that? It was written on the original letter. It was in whatever records the school required. He'd had to sign papers, hadn't he, when the boy turned 11 and those dreadful letters started arriving by owl. Official papers that included date of birth, July 31st. They'd never celebrated it. Not once. Why would they? They celebrated Dudley's birthday, properly, with presents and parties and everything a boy deserved. But the other boy, Harry, though Vernon tried not to think his name, there was no reason to celebrate his existence. He was a duty, not a joy, an obligation, not a son. Petunia had never mentioned his birthday. not in 15 years. She marked Dudley's on the calendar every year, June 23rd, always circled, always with notes about party plans or gift ideas. But July 31st passed unmarked, unmentioned, as though the date didn't exist. Except this year she'd marked it, not as his birthday. Vernon was certain of that. She'd marked it for Dudley's diet milestone. That's what she'd told him 2 weeks ago. 6 weeks of good behavior deserved acknowledgement, but she'd bought a cake on that day, and then she'd realized Vernon had seen it in her face. The exact moment she'd realized, she'd been at the counter and something had happened. Some thought had crossed her mind, and her whole posture had changed. He'd known better than to ask. The Dursleys had an unspoken agreement, developed over 15 years of living with an uncomfortable situation. Don't mention it directly. Don't acknowledge it more than necessary. Maintain normalcy at all costs. If something impossible happens, ignore it until it goes away. If feelings arise that complicate the carefully maintained status quo, push them down until they disappear. It had worked for 15 years. Vernon's telephone sat silent on his desk. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. Outside, the lunchgoers were returning to the building, moving slowly in the heat. He thought about what he'd do when he got home tonight. He'd arrive at 6, as promised. He'd park in the driveway, come through the front door, greet Petunia with a kiss on the cheek as always. He'd ask about her day. She'd have dinner ready, something cold probably given the weather, salad, cold meat. They'd eat in the dining room with the fan on, and he wouldn't mention the cake, even if it was still sitting on the counter. Especially if it was still sitting on the counter, he wouldn't mention it, because Vernon Dursley understood that some silences were more important than words. Some things, once acknowledged, couldn't be unacknowledged. Some doors, once opened, couldn't be closed again. Better to let it lie. Better to preserve the careful equilibrium of their household. Better to pretend that July 31st was simply another day in another sweltering summer. And if a cake appeared and then disappeared, well, these things happened. No need to discuss it. His secretary knocked. "Mr. Dursley, the Hamburg office is ready for your call." "Right," Vernon said, his voice coming out normal, businesslike. "Put them through." He pulled his notes toward him, straightened in his chair, adopted his professional voice and manner. But as the call connected and German voices greeted him, he couldn't quite stop thinking about his wife standing in their kitchen, staring at a calendar, her hand pressed against the counter as though she needed it to hold her upright. Dudley Dursley's bedroom was the second largest in the house, after his parents', and it contained everything a 16-year-old boy could reasonably want. A double bed, a television with his own PlayStation, a computer on a proper desk, shelves lined with books he'd never read and trophies he'd actually won, a wardrobe full of clothes that mostly fit him now, and a window that looked out over the back garden. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, door half open the way he'd started keeping it lately, listening to the silence downstairs. The silence was wrong. Dudley had lived in this house his entire life. He knew its sounds intimately, the particular creak of the stairs, the rhythm of his mother's movements in the kitchen, the drone of his father's voice when he was reading the newspaper aloud to no one in particular. He knew when things were normal and when they weren't. This morning, things weren't normal. He'd heard his mother come back from somewhere, the bakery, probably, based on the timing. Around 8, he'd heard his father's heavy tread on the stairs, the usual morning routine. And then there'd been breakfast, but quieter than usual. No conversation, just the small sounds of eating and the rustle of newspaper. Then his father had left early, which also wasn't quite right. His father usually left at 8:30, precise as clockwork. Today he'd left closer to 8:15. And now his mother was downstairs doing something that sounded like nothing at all. Dudley shifted on the bed. The mattress springs creaked slightly. He was lighter than he'd been a year ago, nearly 2 stone lighter, but he was still heavy enough to make furniture complain. He'd become conscious of these things, the sounds his body made, the space it took up, how much effort it required to move through the world. He'd become conscious of a lot of things, actually, since last summer. His calendar hung on the wall opposite his bed, one of those sports calendars his Aunt Marge had sent him for Christmas. Each month showed a different football match. He'd been meaning to replace it with something else. He didn't really follow football anymore, not since he'd quit the school team, but he hadn't gotten around to it. July showed Arsenal versus Liverpool, and across July 31st, in his own handwriting, he'd written 6 weeks. He'd known what the date was when he'd written it. Of course he'd known. He'd just chosen not to think about it, the same way you chose not to think about a lot of uncomfortable things. But his mother had bought a cake this morning. He didn't know how he knew this. He hadn't seen the cake, but he'd heard something in the quality of the silence downstairs, in the particular way his mother had been moving or not moving, and he knew. She'd bought a cake for him, for his diet milestone, because that was the sort of thing she did. She noticed. She marked things. She wanted him to know his efforts mattered, except she'd bought it on July 31st. Dudley stood up, moved to his window. The back garden looked scorched. The grass was more yellow than green despite his father's obsessive watering. The roses his mother loved looked limp. Everything looked tired, actually, worn down by weeks of relentless heat. He pressed his forehead against the glass, felt the warmth of it. Last summer, he wouldn't have noticed any of this. Last summer, he'd have been focused entirely on himself, on what he wanted, on what he felt like doing, on whether he was bored or hungry or deserving of something. Last summer, the world had existed primarily in relation to Dudley Dursley's immediate desires. And then, the Dementors had come. Dudley's hands curled into fists against the windowsill. He still dreamed about it sometimes. Not every night anymore, but often enough. He'd wake up convinced the cold was real, that the darkness was pressing in, that he couldn't breathe. He'd lie there in his comfortable bed, in his comfortable room, and feel his heart hammering, and remember what it had been like to have every good feeling stripped away until there was nothing left but despair. The worst part, worse than the cold, worse than the fear, had been what he'd seen, or what he'd felt, rather, because he hadn't really seen anything, had he? There'd been no images, but he'd known, suddenly and completely, exactly what he was. He'd seen himself as he actually existed in the world. A bully, a coward, someone who took and gave nothing back, someone who hurt smaller people because he could, someone who'd spent 16 years being the worst version of himself because no one had ever made him be better. He'd seen that he was cruel, not in a theoretical way, not in a way he could dismiss or justify, just, truly, fundamentally, unbearably cruel. And then, Harry had saved him. Dudley's jaw clenched. Harry, who he'd spent years tormenting. Harry, who had every reason to leave him there, to let the Dementors do whatever they did. Harry, who'd pulled out that wand, that impossible, unnatural wand, and fought them off. Who'd gotten him home, who'd probably saved his life. He didn't know how to think about that. For weeks afterward, he'd tried not to. He'd pretended it hadn't happened, the same way his family pretended everything impossible didn't happen. The Dementors were gone. The ministry people had come and gone. Life had returned to normal, or what passed for normal. But he'd kept seeing himself the way the Dementors had made him see himself. And he'd started noticing things, like how his mother flinched slightly when he raised his voice, as though some part of her expected him to hurt her, even though he never had. Like how his father encouraged everything worst in him, the aggression, the entitlement, the casual cruelty, because he thought those were strengths. Like how people at school had been afraid of him, and how he'd enjoyed that fear. Like how Harry lived in the smallest bedroom and ate dinner in silence and existed in their house like a ghost, present but never quite acknowledged. It had started bothering him. Not enough to do anything about it. Not enough to apologize or change or admit anything out loud. But enough that he'd stopped joining in when peers made jokes about Harry at school. Enough that he'd started the diet his mother suggested without his usual tantrums. Enough that he'd quit boxing, which he'd mostly enjoyed because it gave him an excuse to hit people. Small things, pathetic things really. Nothing that made up for 16 years of being awful, but something. He heard a sound downstairs, a chair scraping, his mother moving finally, after what felt like an hour of that wrong silence. Dudley moved away from the window, sat back down on his bed. His room felt stuffy despite the fan rotating slowly in the corner. He should open the window wider, but the air outside was probably just as hot as the air inside. There was no relief anywhere. He looked at his calendar again. July 31st. 6 weeks. He'd been pleased with himself when he'd written that. 6 weeks of actually trying, of not sneaking food, of doing the exercises the dietitian had recommended. 6 weeks of being better, or at least being less awful. His mother had noticed. She'd told him last week that she was proud of him. She'd even suggested they mark it somehow. Nothing big, just an acknowledgement. And he'd felt good about that. He'd felt like maybe he was becoming someone slightly less terrible. But he'd written it on July 31st, and he'd known what that meant, and he'd written it anyway, because Harry's birthday didn't matter. Did it? Harry's birthday had never mattered. They'd never celebrated it. They'd never even mentioned it. It simply wasn't something the Dursleys did, except his mother had bought a cake this morning, and now she was downstairs, doing nothing, in that wrong silence, and his father had left early, and Dudley was sitting here in his room, door half open, feeling something he didn't have a name for. Not guilt, exactly, or not just guilt. Something more complicated than that. Something that had been building for a year now, since the Dementors, since seeing himself clearly for the first time in his life. The bathroom door opened down the hall. The pipes creaked. Harry taking a shower, probably. The water ran for a few minutes, then stopped. A door closed again. Harry was probably in his room now. In the smallest bedroom, the one that had been meant for storage before they'd needed somewhere to put him. Dudley had been in there once or twice when they were much younger, before he'd understood it was off limits. He remembered it being barely big enough for a bed and a dresser, no space for anything else. Dudley had 3 rooms worth of stuff in his bedroom. A computer that had replaced an older computer that had replaced an even older computer. Toys he'd outgrown that his mother kept meaning to donate. Clothes that didn't fit anymore but hadn't been thrown away yet. Books, games, sports equipment, all the accumulated possessions of a childhood where he'd gotten everything he'd wanted and most of what he hadn't known to want. Harry had a trunk and some books. Dudley knew this because he'd seen them once when the door had been open. Last summer, actually, right after the Dementor attack. He'd walked past and the door had been ajar and he'd glimpsed inside. A narrow bed, a small desk, some books stacked neatly, a trunk pushed against one wall. Nothing on the walls, no posters or pictures or any of the things you'd expect in a teenager's room. It had looked like a prison cell, and the worst part, the part that had stuck with him, was that it had looked clean, organized, as though Harry had accepted this tiny space and made it livable through sheer, careful maintenance, as though he'd spent years learning to exist in as small a space as possible without complaint. Dudley's stomach felt tight. He thought about the cake downstairs. He thought about his mother's silence. He thought about the date written on his calendar and the date that he knew, had always known, was written on the calendar downstairs. He thought about 16 years of Harry living in this house and never having a birthday cake. It wasn't fair. The thought came unbidden, unwanted. Dudley tried to push it away. Life wasn't about fair. His father said that all the time. Some people got more than others. That's just how it was. Harry had gotten unlucky. Dead parents, weird magic stuff, having to live with relatives who didn't want him. These things happened. It wasn't Dudley's fault. It wasn't his responsibility to care about it. Except he'd spent a year now seeing himself the way the Dementors had shown him. A year of understanding that he'd been cruel. A year of trying, in small, pathetic ways, to be slightly less awful. And Harry had saved his life. That mattered, didn't it? That should matter. Dudley stood up again, restless. He paced to the window and back. His room suddenly felt too large and too small at the same time. He felt trapped in it, trapped by it, trapped by everything it represented, every toy he'd demanded, every tantrum he'd thrown, every time he'd gotten something he wanted, while Harry got nothing. Downstairs, his mother was still silent. The house felt like it was holding its breath. Dudley moved to his door. He stood there for a long moment, hand on the frame, listening. He could hear nothing. No movement downstairs, no sound from down the hall, just the quiet hum of his computer, the gentle whir of the fan, the distant sound of a lawnmower several houses away. He thought about going downstairs. He thought about asking his mother about the cake. He thought about saying something, he didn't know what, about the date. But he didn't move, because Dudley Dursley didn't know how to talk about uncomfortable things. He'd spent 16 years in a house where uncomfortable things weren't discussed, where everyone pretended and avoided and maintained careful silences. He'd learned that lesson well. So instead, he went back to his bed. He sat down on the edge of it. He looked at his calendar showing July 31st, and his own handwriting marking 6 weeks of trying to be better. And he thought about Harry down the hall, probably sitting in his tiny room, reading or doing homework or staring at the wall, completely unaware that downstairs there was a cake that his aunt had accidentally bought on his birthday. A cake that she didn't know what to do with. Now, a cake that existed in their kitchen, like a truth no one wanted to say out loud. Dudley thought about all of this, and he felt heavy in a way that had nothing to do with his weight. The house remained silent. The afternoon stretched ahead, hot and still and wrong. And Dudley sat in his room with the door half open, listening to nothing, and waiting for something he couldn't name to happen, or not happen, or change. The afternoon settled over Privet Drive like a weight. By 1 o'clock, the temperature had climbed into the high 20s, and the air inside number 4 had taken on that peculiar thickness that comes from too much heat and not enough movement. Every window in the house was open, but there was no breeze. The curtains hung motionless. The air simply sat, heavy and warm and still. Harry was in his room. He'd been there since mid-morning, when he'd ventured downstairs for tea and found the kitchen occupied by a silence so profound it had driven him immediately back upstairs. His aunt had been at the counter, wiping it with a cloth in slow, repetitive motions that suggested she wasn't really thinking about what she was doing. She hadn't looked at him, hadn't spoken, had simply continued wiping the same spot over and over while he'd filled the kettle, waited for it to boil, and retreated with his cup. Now he was sitting on his bed with his Transfiguration textbook open on his lap, not really reading it. The words blurred together. His mind wouldn't focus. It was too hot, and the house was too quiet, and something about the day felt off in a way he couldn't identify. Outside his window, he could see a slice of the back garden and a bit of Mrs. Figg's roof next door. The sky was cloudless, pale blue fading to almost white near the horizon. No birds, no movement, even the usual suburban sounds. Cars passing, children playing, the distant drone of a lawnmower seemed muted, as though the heat had dampened everything. Harry shifted against the wall, trying to find a comfortable position. His bed was narrow, and the mattress had developed a permanent dip in the middle where he slept. The sheets were clean. His aunt insisted on clean sheets, but thin and worn. In winter, this room was freezing. In summer, it was stifling. He was used to it. He'd spent most of his life in small, inadequate spaces. The cupboard under the stairs for his first 11 years, which at least had been cool in summer. Then this room, which was technically bigger, but somehow felt just as confining. 4 walls, a narrow bed, a small desk, a wardrobe that held his meager possessions, a window he could open but not climb out of, a door he could close but not lock from the inside. It was fine. It was better than many alternatives. At least he had a space that was his, even if it was barely larger than the cupboard had been. At least he wasn't at the Dursleys' sufferance, except he was, entirely, and had been for 16 years. Harry closed his Transfiguration book. He wasn't absorbing anything anyway. His mind kept drifting, thoughts fragmenting in the heat. He wondered what Ron and Hermione were doing. Ron would be at the Burrow probably, helping with some household task, or playing Quidditch with his brothers in the orchard. Hermione might be on holiday with her parents. She'd mentioned something about France in her last letter, though the details escaped him now. They both seemed very far away. Harry had received letters from them regularly through June and the first part of July. until the order had tightened security. An owl post had become sporadic. Now he got occasional brief notes, reassuring him they were fine, telling him nothing useful, asking questions they knew he couldn't answer. The letters felt perfunctory, obligatory. "We haven't forgotten you," they seemed to say. "We're still here, even though you're not." He didn't resent it. They had lives, real lives, with families and futures and connections that ran deeper than friendship. He'd always known he was slightly apart from that. The boy who lived at the edges of things, who belonged nowhere completely. A door opened somewhere in the house. Footsteps crossed the landing. Dudley's heavy tread heading toward the bathroom. The pipes creaked as a tap turned on. Water ran for a moment, then stopped. Dudley returned to his room. His door didn't quite close, Harry noticed. It stayed slightly ajar, which was unusual. Dudley usually shut himself in his room completely when he was home. Downstairs, the silence continued. Harry had learned to read the silences of this house, the way some people read weather patterns. There was the silence of his uncle's anger, which pressed down on everything like a storm about to break. There was the silence of his aunt's disapproval, sharp and cold and pointed. There was the silence of avoidance, when the family pretended he didn't exist, which was actually the most comfortable kind. This silence was different. It felt suspended somehow, waiting, as though something had happened or was about to happen, and the house itself was holding its breath. Harry stood up, too restless to sit any longer. His room was too small for proper pacing. 3 steps to the window, 3 steps back, but he did it anyway. His feet were bare on the worn carpet. He could feel the heat of the floor through the thin fibers. He went to the window, looked out at the unchanging view. Mrs. Figg's cat, Tibbles, was sitting on her back fence, a grey shape against the weathered wood. The cat's tail twitched once, then went still. Even the animals seemed oppressed by the heat. Harry's forehead rested against the glass. It was warm, almost hot. Everything was warm. There was no cool surface anywhere, no relief. The world felt baked, dried out, all the moisture leached away by weeks of unrelenting sun. He thought about Grimold Place, which was probably cooler. Old houses with thick walls stayed cooler in summer. He thought about Hogwarts, which was definitely cooler. The castle was always slightly cold, even in June. Stone corridors and high ceilings, and the permanent chill that came from centuries of accumulated winter. He missed it with an ache that had become familiar. Not the danger or the attention or the weight of prophecy, just the place itself, the sense of belonging somewhere, even imperfectly. The knowledge that within those walls he had friends and teachers and a purpose beyond simple survival. Here he had nothing. He was nothing, just an obligation in the smallest bedroom, counting days until he could leave. 23 more days until his birthday, when he could legally use magic outside school, when the protective enchantments tied to this house would no longer matter quite as much, when he could, theoretically, go somewhere else. Except he had nowhere else to go. Grimold Place was Order headquarters, not his home. The Weasleys would take him in, but he wouldn't impose. He'd already taken too much from them, their time, their concern, their son's life, very nearly, in the Department of Mysteries. No, better to stay here. Better to endure these last weeks of summer in this small, hot room, where at least he couldn't endanger anyone. A sound from downstairs. His aunt, moving finally. Harry heard her footsteps cross the kitchen, heard a cabinet open and close, then silence again. He wondered what she was doing, what any of them were doing in this strange, suspended afternoon. His uncle was at work, presumably. Dudley was in his room. His aunt was in the kitchen, apparently engaged in some task that required frequent pauses. It didn't matter. Their lives were their own. He was simply here, a piece of furniture they had to work around, tolerated but not included. Harry moved away from the window, sat back down on his bed. His Transfiguration textbook was still there, still open to the chapter on animate to inanimate transfigurations. He should read it. He should use this time productively, prepare for next year, stay sharp. But the words wouldn't come into focus. He found himself thinking instead about birthdays. This wasn't intentional. He generally tried not to think about birthdays. They'd never been pleasant occasions. As a child, he'd watched Dudley have elaborate parties, bouncy castles and magicians and tables full of presents, while his own birthdays passed unmarked. Sometimes he'd gotten a card from the school, the standard printed kind that went to all students. Once, Mrs. Fig had given him a tin of homemade fudge, carefully when his aunt wasn't looking. At Hogwarts, birthdays were better. Ron and Hermione always remembered. There were cards and small gifts and cake in the common room. Nothing extravagant, but enough to make the day feel acknowledged, to make him feel remembered. This year, though, his 17th birthday, he'd be here, at Privet Drive, where birthdays didn't exist. It was fine. He was used to it. 17 was just a number anyway, even if it meant legal adulthood in the wizarding world. It didn't change anything fundamental. He'd still be the same person, with the same problems, the same burden of prophecy sitting on his shoulders. The afternoon stretched on. Harry eventually gave up on Transfiguration and pulled out a different book, Defensive Magical Theory, by Wilbert Slinkard, which he'd bought in Diagon Alley and never finished. It was dry and theoretical and deeply boring, which made it perfect for this weather. He read the same paragraph 4 times without absorbing it, then finally set the book aside. Maybe he should sleep. That's what people did in hot weather, wasn't it? Slept through the worst of the afternoon heat, waited for evening when things might cool down. But he wasn't tired, just restless, just uncomfortable in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Below him, very faintly, he heard his aunt's footsteps again. She was still in the kitchen, still doing something. The sounds were too indistinct to identify. A drawer opening, something being set down, a pause, another drawer. Harry lay back on his bed, staring at the ceiling. There was a crack in the plaster that ran from the corner to the light fixture. He'd stared at it so many times he could trace its path with his eyes closed. It had been there when he'd moved into this room 6 years ago, and it would probably be there long after he left. Everything would be exactly the same after he left. This room would go back to being storage. The Dursleys would resume their normal life, the one where they had 1 son instead of 2. They'd probably never speak of him again. He'd become a story they'd agreed not to tell, an uncomfortable chapter they'd all decided to forget. That was fine too. He didn't need to be remembered here. This had never been his home, not really. It was just a place where he'd existed, protected by magic he didn't fully understand, blood wards he'd never asked for, his mother's blood, his aunt's blood, the connection that had kept him safe, and made him unwelcome in equal measure. He thought about his mother sometimes, though not often. It hurt too much, usually, and accomplished nothing. She was gone, had been gone for 16 years. All he had of her were scattered memories that might not even be real. A photograph he kept in his trunk, and the abstract knowledge that she'd died to save him. This was supposed to make him feel grateful, he thought, loved, protected. Mostly, it just made him feel guilty. A different sound downstairs, sharper, something being set down with more force than intended. Then silence again, deeper this time. His aunt had stopped moving entirely. Harry rolled onto his side, facing the wall. The wallpaper was a faded cream color with a pattern of tiny flowers. He'd never liked it. He'd never chosen it. It was simply what was there, what he had to look at every day, part of the accumulation of things that made up a life he'd never asked for. The afternoon wore on. The heat didn't break. The silence didn't lift. Harry lay in his narrow bed in his small room and waited for the day to end, the way he'd waited for countless days to end before this one. Patient, practiced, expecting nothing. Downstairs, Petunia stood in her kitchen, one hand pressed flat against the counter. She'd been trying to do normal things. She'd wiped every surface twice. She'd organized the spice drawer, which didn't need organizing. She'd taken out ingredients for dinner and put them back. She'd rearranged the contents of the refrigerator so many times that the butter had started to sweat. The cake was still there, still on the counter where she'd left it hours ago. She'd thought about moving it. She'd thought about eating it. She'd thought about throwing it away. She'd done none of these things. Instead, she'd cleaned around it, worked around it, acknowledged its presence without acknowledging what it meant. The calendar still showed July 31st in her neat handwriting. She'd looked at it perhaps 20 times since this morning. Each time, the date remained the same. Each time, the small notation, 6 weeks, seemed to grow larger, more accusatory. She should cross it out. She should amend it. She should write something else, anything else, that would make it just a date again, just a normal day in a normal July. But she couldn't seem to make herself do it. Petunia moved to the sink, filled a glass with water, drank it without tasting it. The water was lukewarm from the pipes, slightly metallic. She'd been meaning to mention to Vernon that they should have the plumbing checked. The water always tasted off in summer. She'd been meaning to mention a lot of things to Vernon. She never did. The back door was open, letting in air that was no cooler than the air inside. She could see her roses from here, wilting in their bed. She should water them. They needed watering. But the thought of carrying heavy watering cans back and forth in this heat felt overwhelming. Everything felt overwhelming. Petunia set down her glass. Her hands found the counter again, bracing herself. This had become a habit today, touching the counter, feeling its solidity, using it to anchor herself when her thoughts started to drift in directions she didn't want them to go. Upstairs, everything was quiet. Dudley in his room, the boy in his, both of them existing in their separate spaces, separate lives, under the same roof. 2 boys, 2 bedrooms, one with everything, one with almost nothing. This wasn't her fault, Petunia told herself. She hadn't created this situation. She'd been handed a baby on a doorstep and told to raise it. What was she supposed to do? Pretend it was her own. Pretend she was happy about it. Pretend away 16 years of resentment and grief and fear. She'd done her duty. She'd kept him. She'd fed him and clothed him and sent him to school. She'd done more than many people would have done in her situation. The boy had survived, hadn't he? He was fine. He'd never been abused, not really, just not welcomed, not loved. Was she supposed to love him? Was that what normal people would do? Petunia's throat felt tight. She swallowed, trying to ease it. Her eyes felt hot, which was just the temperature, just the stifling heat of the kitchen. She looked at the cake again. Chocolate icing, neat piped edges, small enough for 4 people to share. If 4 people were on speaking terms. If 4 people were a family. But they weren't a family. They were 3 people and 1 obligation. 3 Dursleys and 1 Potter. That's how it had always been. That's how it would always be. The clock on the wall showed 2:30. Hours still until Vernon came home. Hours until dinner. Hours of this suspended, suffocating afternoon. Petunia picked up her cleaning cloth again, found a spot on the counter that needed attention, began to wipe it, slow circles, repetitive motion, the closest thing to comfort she could find. Evening crept toward Privet Drive with the same reluctance the day had shown in passing. By 6 o'clock, the sun had lost some of its ferocity, but the heat remained, trapped in the pavement, radiating from brick walls, settling into every enclosed space. The air had taken on that golden quality that comes before sunset, thick and amber-colored, making everything look slightly unreal. Vernon's car pulled into the driveway at 5 minutes past 6. Not late exactly, but later than his usual precision. He'd sat in the office car park for 10 minutes after the workday ended, hands on the steering wheel, staring at nothing, thinking about going home. Eventually, he'd started the engine. There was nowhere else to go. Now he turned off the ignition and sat for another moment in his own driveway, looking at his house. Number 4, Privet Drive. Neat, respectable, identical to every other house on the street, except for the small differences Petunia maintained. The better trimmed hedges, the glossier front door, the garden that was somehow always slightly more manicured than the neighbors. His house, his life, his carefully constructed normalcy. He got out of the car, collected his briefcase from the passenger seat, locked the door with a decisive click. The sound echoed slightly in the evening quiet. Most people were inside at this hour, having dinner or watching television. A few children played further down the street, their voices carrying on the still air. Vernon walked up the path to his front door. His key turned in the lock with its familiar resistance. He'd been meaning to oil it for weeks. The door swung open onto the hallway, dim and cool after the brightness outside. "I'm home," he called, his voice loud in the quiet house. "In the kitchen," Petunia's voice came back, steady, normal. Vernon set his briefcase by the stairs, loosened his tie. He could smell something, salad dressing, perhaps, or cold meat, something appropriate for the weather. Petunia always planned appropriately. He walked to the kitchen, rehearsing normalcy in his head. Ask about her day. Mention the Hamburg call went well. Perhaps suggest they eat in the garden if it's cool enough. Maintain the routine. Keep everything on track. But when he entered the kitchen, he stopped. The cake was still there. It sat on the counter exactly where it had been that morning, in its white bakery box, lid slightly askew. The chocolate icing had lost some of its gloss in the heat. The piped edges looked slightly soft. But it was unmistakably the same cake, unmoved, unacknowledged, occupying the same impossible space it had occupied for 10 hours. Petunia was at the table, setting out plates. She had her back to him, her movements precise and controlled. The table was set for 3. Vernon's place at the head, Dudley's to his right, her own to his left. Salad bowl in the center, sliced ham on a platter, bread in a basket. Everything neat, everything appropriate, everything except the cake on the counter. Vernon opened his mouth, closed it, moved further into the kitchen. "Good day?" Petunia asked, not turning around. "Yes," Vernon said. His voice came out slightly rough. He cleared his throat. "Yes, fine. The Hamburg call went well. Very productive." "That's good." She turned then, carrying a pitcher of water to the table. Her face was composed, carefully blank. She met his eyes for half a second, then looked away. "Dinner's ready. We're eating in here. It's cooler than the dining room." "Right," Vernon said. "Good thinking." He stood there, jacket still on, tie loosened but not removed, looking at his wife. She looked tired, he thought. There were lines around her eyes he didn't usually notice. Her hair, always so carefully styled, had come slightly loose. A few strands clung to her neck. "Pet," he started. "I'll call Dudley," she interrupted, moving past him toward the hallway. "Dudley, dinner." Heavy footsteps upstairs. Dudley's voice muffled. "Coming." Petunia returned to the kitchen, picked up a serving spoon, set it down, picked it up again. Her hands were never quite still, never quite purposeful. Vernon took off his jacket, hung it over the back of his chair. He sat down at his place, unfolded his napkin with deliberate care. The kitchen felt surreal in the evening light, familiar and strange at once. The same kitchen where they'd eaten dinner for 15 years, but changed somehow, charged, like a room where something had happened or was about to happen. Dudley came in, moving with the careful slowness of someone trying not to draw attention. He'd lost weight, Vernon noticed again. His face was less round. His clothes fit better. Petunia had been right to push the diet. The boy looked healthier. "Evening, son," Vernon said, forcing heartiness into his voice. "How was your day?" "Fine," Dudley said, sliding into his chair. His eyes went immediately to the cake on the counter, then away. "Hot." "Scorcher," Vernon agreed. He reached for the salad bowl, began serving himself. "Supposed to break tomorrow, according to the forecast. Maybe some rain." "That would be nice," Petunia said. She was still standing, still not quite sitting down. "The garden needs it." "Roses are looking poorly," Vernon observed. Safe topic, normal topic. "Might need to give them extra water tonight, ban or no ban, after dark, when no one can see." "Yes," Petunia said. "Perhaps." She sat down finally, picked up her fork, set it down, folded her hands in her lap. They ate in near silence. Vernon chewed his ham methodically, tasting nothing. Dudley pushed salad around his plate, occasionally taking small, careful bites. His diet portions, his new habits. Petunia cut her food into precise pieces, ate perhaps a third of it. The evening light shifted, deepened. The kitchen grew dimmer. No one turned on the overhead light. The dimness felt appropriate somehow, easier. Vernon tried to think of conversation, work stories, neighborhood gossip, plans for the weekend. His mind felt blank. The cake sat on the counter in its white box, present and impossible. Finally, Dudley spoke. "Mum." Petunia's head came up sharply. "Yes?" Dudley was looking at his plate, not at her. "That cake, on the counter." The silence that followed felt like a physical thing. Vernon's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Petunia's hands tightened on her napkin. "Yes," she said again, her voice very level. "Is it—" Dudley stopped, started again. "What's it for?" Vernon felt something twist in his chest. "Don't," he thought. "Don't say it. Don't make this real." Petunia looked at her son, really looked at him, for what felt like the first time all day. Her face remained composed, but something flickered in her eyes, something that might have been pain or might have been something else entirely. "I bought it this morning," she said carefully. "For it was meant to be for—" She stopped. The sentence hung there, unfinished, impossible to complete. Dudley waited. Vernon waited. The kitchen waited. "It was an accident," Petunia said finally. "I didn't realize the date when I wasn't thinking." "The date," Dudley repeated. Not a question, a confirmation. "Yes." Another silence. Vernon could hear his own breathing, loud in his ears. Could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock, the distant sound of children playing streets away. "So what are you going to do with it?" Dudley asked. "I don't know," Petunia said. The words came out barely above a whisper. "I don't know." Vernon cleared his throat. "Perhaps," he said, his voice coming out too loud, "perhaps we should just—" He stopped. He had no idea how to finish that sentence. Just what? Eat it? Ignore it? Throw it away? Acknowledge what it represented? "It's just a cake," he said instead. "Just a cake from the bakery. Chocolate. Nothing special." But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. Nothing in this kitchen was just anything. Not today. Not with that date on the calendar and that cake on the counter and 16 years of careful silence threatening to crack open. Dudley pushed his chair back slightly. "Can I be excused?" "You've barely eaten," Petunia said automatically. "I'm not very hungry." "The heat," Vernon said quickly, "affects the appetite. Go on, son." Dudley left. His footsteps were heavy on the stairs, then overhead, then his door closing, not slamming, just closing with quiet finality. Vernon and Petunia sat at their kitchen table, dinner half eaten between them, evening light fading around them. "We should—" Vernon started. "Don't," Petunia said. "Please don't. Pat, I don't want to talk about it." Her voice was still level, still controlled, but something in it made Vernon stop. "I don't want to discuss it or explain it or anything. It's done. It happened. I bought a cake on the wrong day, and now it's sitting there, and I don't know what to do about it." We could what, Vernon?" She looked at him directly now. "We could what?" He had no answer. They sat in silence while the evening deepened into dusk. Finally, Petunia stood. She began clearing the table with sharp, efficient movements. Vernon helped, carrying plates to the sink, scraping uneaten food into the bin. They moved around each other in practiced synchronization. Two people who'd shared a kitchen for 20 years. The cake remained on the counter. Neither of them touched it. Neither of them mentioned it again. When the dishes were done, Petunia dried her hands with careful precision. She folded the tea towel and hung it on its hook. She wiped down the counter, around the cake, not touching it. "I'm going to watch television," Vernon announced. "That program about gardens is on." "All right. Will you—" "In a moment." Vernon left her there in the dimming kitchen. He walked down the hallway to the sitting room, turned on the television, lowered himself into his armchair with a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. On the screen, someone was discussing rose pruning. Vernon watched without seeing, his mind elsewhere. In the kitchen, Petunia stood alone. The cake sat on the counter in the growing dark. Upstairs, both boys were in their rooms, her son and her sister's son, both of them silent, both of them separate, both of them living in a house where things had been set in motion that couldn't easily be stopped. She looked at the cake. She looked at the calendar. She looked at her hands, still slightly damp from the dishes. Then she did something she hadn't planned to do, something that surprised her even as she was doing it. She took down 4 plates from the cabinet. Small plates, dessert plates. She set them on the counter in a neat row. She opened a drawer, took out a knife, a cake server. Her hands were shaking slightly. She pressed them flat against the counter until they steadied. Then she cut the cake. 4 neat slices. She served them onto the 4 plates with careful precision. Equal portions. Perfect portions. 4 plates for 4 people. For the family that lived in this house, whether they were a family or not. She stood looking at them for a long moment. 4 plates of chocolate cake in the dimming kitchen. The most impossible thing she'd done all day. And she'd been doing impossible things since morning. 1 plate she would take to Vernon. 1 she would leave for herself. 1 was Dudley's. And 1. She picked up the plate. Her hands had stopped shaking. She felt very calm suddenly, very clear. She carried the plate out of the kitchen, down the hallway, toward the stairs. Behind her, 3 plates of cake remained on the counter, waiting. The house held its breath. Dudley heard his mother's footsteps on the stairs. He'd been lying on his bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of dinner ending downstairs, the scrape of chairs, the running water in the sink, his father's voice muffled, his mother's reply. Then his father's heavy tread toward the sitting room, the television turning on, its familiar murmur. And now his mother's footsteps, climbing slowly, deliberately. They paused on the landing. Dudley held his breath. The footsteps continued down the hallway, past his room, past the bathroom, to the smallest bedroom at the end of the hall. A knock, quiet but distinct in the evening silence. Dudley sat up. His mother never knocked on that door. None of them did. They generally pretended the room didn't exist, that its occupant was simply absent even when he was there. Walking past it without acknowledgement was an art they'd perfected over years. But she was knocking now. Dudley couldn't hear words, if any were spoken. Just the creak of a door opening, a pause, the door closing again. Then his mother's footsteps returning, passing his door, descending the stairs. Dudley stood up. He moved to his door, opened it quietly, looked down the hallway. The smallest bedroom's door was closed again. No light showed underneath it, or rather, no more light than usual. Harry never turned on his overhead light. He used a small desk lamp that gave off barely any glow. Dudley stood there for a long moment, one hand on his doorframe. Then he moved, not thinking about it, not planning it, just moving. He went downstairs. The kitchen was dim now, the overhead lights still off. His mother had turned on the small lamp over the sink, which cast everything in a yellowish glow. She was standing with her back to him, looking out the window at the darkening garden. "Mum," Dudley said. She turned. Her face was composed, but something in her eyes looked raw, exposed. "I thought you'd gone to bed," she said. "Not tired." Dudley looked at the counter. 3 plates of cake sat there, neat and identical. Chocolate cake with chocolate icing, each slice perfect. "You cut it. Yes. Why? Petunia's hands found the edge of the sink behind her. I don't know, she said. Then more firmly. Because it was there. Because it needed to be dealt with. Because... She stopped. Dudley waited. Because it's his birthday, she said, finally. The words came out flat, factual. Whether we acknowledge it or not, whether we want it to be or not, it's his birthday, and there's a cake in this house, and I... She pressed her lips together, said nothing more. Dudley looked at the 3 plates. You took him a piece. Yes. Did he say anything? No. He looked... Petunia paused. Surprised, I put it on his desk and left. The television murmured from the sitting room. His father, watching his gardening program, pretending everything was normal, maintaining the fiction that this was just another evening, just another summer day. Dudley moved to the counter. He picked up one of the plates, not thinking about which one, just choosing, and held it. Dudley, his mother said. A warning or a question, he couldn't tell. I'm going to... He stopped. What was he going to do? I'm just going to take this upstairs. That's yours, Petunia said, if you want it. The other is for your father. The third is mine. Dudley looked at the plate in his hands, looked at the 2 remaining on the counter. 3 plates. His mother had said 4, hadn't she? She'd cut 4 slices, 1 for each of them. 4 people in this house, 4 slices of cake. Right, Dudley said. Thanks. He started to leave, then turned back. His mother was still standing by the sink, hands behind her, looking at nothing. Mum, he said, are you... I'm fine, she said quickly. Go on, eat your cake. Dudley climbed the stairs slowly, plate held carefully level. The cake wobbled slightly with each step. At the top, he paused again on the landing. His room was to the right. The smallest bedroom was to the left, at the end of the hall. Dudley stood there, holding his plate of cake, looking at that closed door. He could go to his room, eat his cake, watch television or read or do any of the normal things he did in the evening. Pretend today was just another day. Pretend his mother hadn't knocked on that door. Pretend there weren't 4 plates of cake when there should only have been 3. Or, Dudley walked down the hallway. His feet seemed very loud on the carpet. Each step felt deliberate, impossible to take back. He reached the door at the end, raised his hand, hesitated. He'd never knocked on this door before, had never needed to, had barely acknowledged the door existed beyond knowing vaguely that Harry was behind it. But his mother had knocked, and if she could do something unprecedented, maybe he could too. Dudley knocked, 2 quiet taps with his knuckles. Yeah? Harry's voice, muffled, surprised. Dudley opened the door. The room was exactly as he'd glimpsed it before, small, cramped, brutally neat. Harry was sitting at his desk, the small lamp casting a circle of light. A textbook was open in front of him, and on the corner of the desk, untouched, sat a plate of chocolate cake. Harry had turned in his chair, looking at Dudley with an expression somewhere between confusion and wariness. His hand had moved slightly toward his pocket, toward his wand, Dudley realized, an automatic response to the door opening unexpectedly. Dudley stopped. He'd walked down here without thinking, but now he didn't know what to say. Mum cut the cake. Yeah, Harry said slowly. I noticed. Dudley stood in the doorway, acutely aware that he was blocking most of the light from the hallway, that his bulk took up a significant portion of the door frame, that in this small space he was overwhelmingly large. He stepped inside, which somehow made it worse. The room was tiny. With both of them in it, there was barely space to breathe. "She bought it for me," Dudley said. "For my diet thing. 6 weeks. She was going to—" He gestured vaguely with the plate, but then she realized what date it was. Harry's expression didn't change. "Right. So she cut it into 4 pieces. She took you one. These are—" Dudley looked at the plate in his hands, then at the identical plate on Harry's desk. "Mine, I guess. I was bringing it upstairs and I thought—" He stopped again. He thought what? That he'd share this moment? That he'd acknowledge something that had gone unacknowledged for 16 years? "I'm not really hungry," Dudley said finally. It came out wrong, inadequate. "The heat, you know, kills appetite." "Yeah," Harry said again, still wary, still watching him with that careful expression. Dudley looked around the tiny room. There was nowhere to sit except the bed, which would be weird, or the desk chair, which Harry occupied. So he just stood there, plate in hands, feeling foolish. "Last summer," Dudley said abruptly. "With the— he—" Couldn't say Dementors. The words stuck in his throat. "With what happened? In the underpass?" Harry's posture changed slightly, became more tense. "What about it?" "You saved me," Dudley said. "You could have left me there. You didn't." "You're my cousin," Harry said, as though this explained everything. "I was awful to you," Dudley said. The words came out harder than he intended. "For years, I've been thinking about it, since then, about how I was." Harry said nothing. His face was carefully blank now, giving nothing away. "I'm not—" Dudley took a breath. "I'm not apologizing. Not really. I don't know how to. I don't think I could, properly. Not for—" He gestured vaguely. "Everything. All of it." "Then why are you here?" Harry asked. Not hostile, just genuinely confused. Dudley looked at the plate in his hands. "Because it's your birthday," he said. "And there's cake. And Mum bought it accidentally, but she still cut it into 4 pieces. And I thought—" He didn't know what he thought. That sharing cake made up for 16 years of cruelty. That one awkward gesture could erase everything that had come before. That acknowledging Harry's existence for one evening somehow balanced the scales. No, nothing balanced the scales. Nothing fixed this. But his mother had knocked on this door, which she'd never done before, and she'd given Harry a piece of cake, which she'd never done before. And Dudley was standing here, in this room he'd never properly entered, trying to find words for something he didn't understand. "It's just cake," Dudley said finally. "I know that. I know it doesn't— I know one piece of cake doesn't mean anything. But it's your birthday. And you should. Someone should say that, at least." He set his plate down on the desk, next to Harry's untouched slice. 2 identical plates of chocolate cake in the small circle of lamplight. "Happy birthday," Dudley said. The words felt foreign in his mouth, uncomfortable. He'd never said them to Harry before, hadn't even thought them probably. "I mean, yeah, that." He turned to leave, suddenly desperate to be out of this small room, out of this uncomfortable moment he'd created. "Dudley." He stopped, hand on the doorframe. "Thanks," Harry said. His voice was quiet, careful, as though he was testing the weight of the word. Yeah, thanks." Dudley nodded, didn't turn around. "Right." He left, pulling the door closed behind him with quiet precision. In the hallway, he stood for a moment, breathing slightly hard as though he'd been running. His hands were shaking. He pressed them against his sides until they steadied. What had he just done? What had any of them just done today? His mother had bought a cake on the wrong day, or maybe the right day, depending on how you looked at it. She'd realized what it meant. She'd spent the entire day in some kind of silent crisis, and then she'd cut the cake anyway, had knocked on that door, had acknowledged for the first time in 16 years. That July 31st meant something, and Dudley had followed, had taken his words, inadequate, fumbling words, to the cousin he'd tormented for most of their lives, had said happy birthday to someone who'd never heard it from any of them before. It didn't fix anything. Dudley understood that clearly. One uncomfortable conversation and 2 plates of cake didn't undo 16 years of deliberate cruelty, didn't make them family, didn't even make them friends. But it was something. Some small shift in the permanent winter of this house. Some acknowledgement that Harry was a person who had birthdays, who'd saved Dudley's life, who existed as more than just an obligation in the smallest bedroom. Dudley went to his room, sat on his bed. The house was quiet around him. Television murmuring downstairs, his mother in the kitchen, Harry down the hall with 2 pieces of cake on his desk. 4 people in this house. 4 pieces of cake. For the first time, maybe. 4 people who'd acknowledged each other as human beings, even briefly, even uncomfortably. It wasn't much, but it was more than yesterday. Dudley lay back on his bed, staring at his ceiling, and thought about dementors and birthdays and the strange, impossible day that was finally, slowly, coming to an end. Night settled over Privet Drive with a gentleness the day had lacked. By 10 o'clock, the heat had finally broken, not dramatically, not with the promised rain, but with a subtle shift in the air. A breeze had picked up, carrying with it the faint coolness that comes after sunset in summer. Windows that had been open all day now admitted something other than stifling warmth. Harry sat by his window, looking out at the darkened street. The plate of cake sat on his desk behind him. Both plates, actually. He'd eaten neither. He'd sat staring at them for perhaps 20 minutes after Dudley left, trying to understand what had happened, trying to process the unprecedented reality of his aunt knocking on his door, of cake appearing on his desk, of Dudley standing in his doorway saying happy birthday in a voice that sounded like the words hurt coming out. Eventually, he'd moved to the window, needing air, needing space, needing to look at something other than those 2 impossible plates. The street was quiet. Most houses showed the blue flicker of televisions in darkened rooms. A cat, probably Mrs. Figg's, moved along the pavement with liquid grace, hunting or patrolling, or simply being feline. The street lamps cast their orange glow in neat circles. Everything looked normal. The world outside this window continued exactly as it always had, suburban, ordered, predictable. But inside number 4, something had shifted. Harry pressed his forehead against the glass, feeling its coolness. He thought about birthdays. His birthdays, specifically. The ones at the Dursleys, which had always passed in silence, and the ones at Hogwarts, which hadn't. His 11th birthday, when Hagrid had given him a slightly squashed cake with Happy Birthday Harry written on it in green icing. The first birthday cake he could remember receiving. The first time someone had acknowledged the date mattered. His 12th, 13th, 14th birthdays at the Burrow, or Grimmauld Place, or Hogwarts. Cards from Ron and Hermione. Small gifts. Cake in the common room. Nothing elaborate, but enough. Enough to feel remembered. enough to feel like someone cared that he'd survived another year. But never here. Never at Privet Drive. Here, July 31st had always been just another day in summer. A date on the calendar with no significance. A birthday that didn't exist because the person having it wasn't quite real enough to celebrate. Until today. Harry didn't know what to do with today. His aunt had bought cake. By accident, yes. Dudley had explained that. She'd been thinking of Dudley's diet milestone, had marked the date without connecting it to anything else. But when she'd realized, when that connection had formed, she hadn't thrown the cake away. She'd kept it, had let it sit on the counter all day, this impossible object, this accidental acknowledgement. And then she'd cut it into 4 pieces, had brought one to him. She hadn't said anything, hadn't explained or apologized or even looked at him directly, had just set the plate on his desk with careful precision and left. But the gesture itself, the simple fact of it, had been louder than any words. And then Dudley, knocking on his door, standing in his tiny room looking uncomfortable and large and somehow younger than 16, fumbling through half-formed sentences about last summer, about being awful, about birthdays and cake and acknowledgement. "Happy birthday," Dudley had said, as though the words were unfamiliar, as though he was learning a new language. Harry didn't know what to do with any of it. Downstairs, he heard movement. His aunt, probably, doing final things in the kitchen before bed. The sounds were normal, water running, a light switching off, footsteps crossing to the stairs. But they felt different tonight, less hostile, less like the movements of someone maintaining a household that contained an unwanted obligation. More like Harry didn't let himself finish that thought. Nothing had changed, not really. One birthday acknowledged didn't erase 16 years of being unwanted. One piece of cake didn't make them family. One awkward conversation with Dudley didn't undo a childhood of bullying and casual cruelty. But it was something. Harry turned from the window, looked at his desk. 2 plates of cake in the lamplight, chocolate with chocolate icing. The icing had gone slightly soft in the heat, but the cakes themselves looked fine. He should eat them, or eat one at least. It seemed wasteful not to. Rude, perhaps, though he didn't know if rudeness applied in situations this strange. He sat down at his desk, pulled one of the plates toward him, picked up the fork Dudley had left. The cake was ordinary, bakery cake, nothing special, the kind you could buy in any town. But it had been bought on his birthday, had been cut for him, had been delivered to his room by family members who'd never acknowledged his birthday before. That made it extraordinary. Harry took a bite. It tasted like chocolate cake, sweet, a bit dry, perfectly average. He chewed slowly, swallowed, took another bite. He thought about his mother, about Petunia's sister, about blood and protection, and the complicated mathematics of family that had kept him alive and unwanted in equal measure. His mother had died to save him. Her sacrifice had created the protection that bound him to this house, to his mother's blood, to the sister who'd resented her for being special. And today, that sister had bought him cake. Not on purpose, not with love, but she'd done it anyway. And when she'd realized what she'd done, she hadn't undone it. She'd let it stand, had made it real by cutting it, by serving it, by bringing it to him. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't love or acceptance or any of the things that should exist between family members. but it was recognition. Simple, uncomfortable recognition that he existed, that he had birthdays, that he was a person, not just an obligation. Maybe that was enough. For today, at least. Maybe that was more than he'd had yesterday. Harry finished the slice slowly, set down his fork. The second plate still sat there. Dudley's, technically, though Dudley had left it. An offering, an apology without words, a gesture that meant nothing and everything at once. Harry left it there. Tomorrow, he'd figure out what to do with it. Tonight, it could simply exist. Evidence that something unprecedented had happened in this house. Downstairs, Petunia sat at the kitchen table in the dark. She'd turned off all the lights, had told Vernon she was coming up to bed soon, but had found herself unable to climb the stairs. So she sat in her kitchen, in the dark, with the remains of the day around her. The cake was gone. 4 plates washed and put away. 4 forks cleaned and returned to the drawer. Everything neat again, ordered, as though nothing had happened. But something had happened. She'd knocked on that door, had given him cake, had acknowledged for the first time in 16 years that July 31st meant something beyond her own careful calendar notations. Petunia pressed her hands flat on the table. The surface was cool now, the heat of the day finally dissipating. She thought about Lily, about her sister, about 2 girls in a different kitchen long ago, learning to bake. She thought about the day Lily had gotten her Hogwarts letter, about the joy and terror and bitter jealousy that had consumed her, about being left behind while her sister went somewhere magical, somewhere Petunia could never follow. She thought about their parents, proud and confused, and eventually gone, about being the only one left to remember that Lily Evans had been a person before she was a witch, before she was Harry Potter's mother, before she was a sacrifice and a martyr and a story. She thought about the baby on the doorstep, about 16 years of obligation and resentment, and the careful avoidance of anything that might crack the normal life she'd built. And she thought about today, about accidentally buying cake, about the long suspended hours of not knowing what to do with it, about finally cutting it and serving it and doing something she'd never imagined doing. It didn't fix anything. Petunia knew that. One birthday didn't undo 16 years. One gesture didn't make up for everything she hadn't done, everything she deliberately withheld. But it was something, some small acknowledgement that the boy upstairs was her sister's son, that he had a right to exist in this house, even if she didn't love him, even if she never would. Maybe that was enough. Maybe small acknowledgements were all she had to give. Petunia stood, moved through her dark kitchen, checking locks, checking windows, her nightly routine, unchanged. But something had changed, something so small it might not matter, but present nonetheless. She climbed the stairs slowly. Vernon was already asleep, snoring softly in their room. Dudley's light was off, his door closed, and at the end of the hall, a thin line of light showed under the smallest bedroom's door. Petunia paused there, just for a moment, not knocking, not speaking, just acknowledging silently that someone was there, that someone lived behind that door, that today had been his birthday, whether she'd wanted it to be or not. Then she continued to her own room, changed into her nightgown, got into bed beside Vernon, lay in the dark, listening to his breathing, feeling the day settle around her. At number 4, Privet Drive, night deepened. 4 people in 4 rooms, not quite connecting, not quite as separate as before. Vernon slept, having decided without deciding that some things were better left unexamined, that tomorrow they would return to normal, whatever normal meant now. Dudley lay awake, thinking about dementors and birthdays and the strange weight of trying to be better than you were. Petunia stared at the ceiling, remembering sisters and kitchens and the complicated mathematics of family, and Harry sat by his window, empty plate beside him, watching the quiet street and feeling something shift in the permanent winter of this house. Not warmth, not yet, maybe never, but something less cold, something fractionally less unbearable. The night was cooler than the day had been. A breeze moved through open windows, carrying with it the promise of change. Small change, imperfect change, but change nonetheless. Morning would come, routines would resume. The careful silences of the Dursley household would settle back into place. But tonight, July 31st, had happened at Privet Drive. A birthday had been acknowledged. Cake had been shared. Words had been spoken that couldn't be unspoken. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't love. It wasn't forgiveness or healing or any of the things that should happen in families. But it was recognition. Simple, human recognition. And for this one night, in this one house, that was enough. The street lamps glowed. The cat finished its patrol. The world turned slowly toward tomorrow. And at number 4, Privet Drive, 4 people slept or didn't sleep, changed or unchanged, bound together by blood and obligation, and now, perhaps, by something slightly more human than that. The smallest of truces, fragile, imperfect, but real.